Good afternoon. I'm Noah McCarty, the acting dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, and on behalf of the school, the James Madison Program, the Center for the Study of Religion, the Program in Latin American Studies, and the Center for Migration Development, I would like to welcome you all to this afternoon's panel called Debating Immigration. Let me relate a recent classroom experience of mine to illustrate exactly why I think today's discussion is both timely and crucial. Last year, I taught a course on the political polarization of the United States as part of Princeton's renowned freshman seminar program. As part of the course, we were to discuss all of the big political issues that divide the American public. But one of the things I found was that the issues that divide the American public do not divide Princeton freshmen. So when we talked about social issues like abortion, gay rights, and stem cell research, almost all students took a fairly conventional liberal position. When we talked about economic and distributive issues, the students cohered to a fairly centrist position. They found increasing inequality troublesome, but felt that American society was limited in what we could do about it. They would agree with the proposition that markets with a degree of state supervision is the way to allocate resources. So no big divide so far. But when we got to immigration policy, all vestiges of consensus disappeared. Students could not agree at all about the desirability of more legal immigration, or whether illegal immigration was a problem, and whether anything could or should be done about it. In retrospect, this is not a terribly surprising outcome. Immigration is an issue that divides America in so many ways. It divides us on different conceptions of our humanitarian responsibilities. It divides us on whether those responsibilities are universal or whether they're local. It divides us on issues of economic growth versus the distribution of economic resources. It divides us on what citizenship means and what it requires. It gets to fundamental questions of what it means to be an American. And furthermore, it taps in to the divides in race and ethnicity and diversity in American society. So today's panel will undoubtedly cover all of these debates and many more. And so I look forward to a very stimulating discussion. Let me just quickly introduce today's distinguished panelists. To my far left is Roger Hernandez, who writes a nationally syndicated column distributed by King Feature Syndicate to some 40 newspapers. And he also teaches writing at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. He's the co-author of Cubans in America, A Vibrant History of a People in Exile, and the author of Immigration, part of a series of Gallup major trends and events, The Pulse of Our Nation from 1900 to the present. He's written for the New York Times, New Jersey Monthly, Washington Journalism Review, and French and Spanish language versions of Reader's Digest. To my immediate left is Doug Massey, professor of sociology and public affairs here at Princeton, whose research focuses on international migration, race and housing discrimination, education, urban poverty, and Latin America. He is the author of Return of the L Word, A Liberal Vision for the New Century, and Strangers in a Strange Land, Humans in an Urbanizing World. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. To my immediate right, Peter Schuck, a professor at Yale Law School, whose major fields of teaching and research are tort law, immigration, citizenship, and refugee law, groups, diversity in law, and administrative law. He is the author of several books and is co-editor with James Q. Wilson of the forthcoming Understanding America. He is a member of the American Law Institute's Advisory Committee for the Restatement of Torts, Basic Principles, and a contributing editor to the American Lawyer. Farther to my right is Robert Wuthnow, professor and chair of the Sociology Department. He teaches and researches in the area of sociology, of religion and cultural sociology using both quantitative and qualitative methods. He's the author of several books, including God and Mammon in American, Growing Up Religious, Christian and Jews and Their Journeys of Faith, Acts of Compassion, Caring for Others, and Helping Ourselves, which received a Pulitzer Prize nomination. Finally, let me turn to the convener of this panel and the editor of the book on which it's based, Carol Swain, of the University of Vanderbilt Law School, who is a recognized expert on race, immigration, black leadership, and evangelical politics. She's provided commentary on BBC Radio, CNN's Lou Dobbs, CNN's Paula Zahn, Fox News, PBS's Washington Journal, NewsHour, and ABC News. She's authored a number of books, including having edited recently Debating Immigration, the book on which we are going to talk today. She's also a member of the James Madison Society here at Princeton. So let me turn it over to Carol for a few remarks.
I'd like to thank all of you for coming here today and to say that I'm really back home, that Princeton is home for me in a lot of ways. This is the institution that gave me my academic start. I was a green country girl from Virginia that came here, and I was mentored, and I was able to get tenure here at Princeton, and I was able to gain the foundation that enabled me to go other places. And I'd like to recognize my Uncle Fred Greenstein. I'd like to have him stand up, please. He was the chair of the politics department when I was hired, and he's someone that has been a significant figure in my life. And there's some other people here as well that have been significant in my life, and I would not want to start without acknowledging Fred. And there are two men of God in this audience that I've invited because after leaving Princeton, I had a born-again Christian experience, and so I'm a new creature. I'd like to have Pastor Lindemann stand up and Pastor Matt Restuccia. And Pastor Lindemann is from Nassau Christian Center, and Pastor Matt is from the Westerly Road Church. And these are people that have become significant to me as I return to Princeton from time to visit my grandchildren. One of my sons married a Princeton girl, and so I'm frequently in this area. I'm indebted to many people that made this symposium possible. First of all, I'd like to thank Nolan McCarty. I mean, this is a big deal having the acting dean of the Woodrow Wilson School to take 90 minutes or more of his time to moderate this panel and to introduce me, and I'm deeply honored by that. And I would also like to thank Robbie George of the Politics Department and James Madison Program because he sponsored the initial conference that made the book possible. The book grew out of a conference in 2005 when I was a fellow here at Princeton. And so he has been significant in my career. I'd also like to have, Reggie Cohen slipped out, but Reggie Cohen was very instrumental in pulling this conference together. And at one time when I was at Princeton, she was my secretary, and she moved up, I left. But I call her my Jewish mother, and she has mothered me, and she's always been there, and I really feel that I owe her a lot. I'd also like to have Dale Satin stand because she has been instrumental with this program. She has worked, she's with the Woodrow Wilson School, the events coordinator. She really helped make this happen as well. My co-sponsors have been named, but I will name them again because I owe them a big thank you. One is the Center for Religion and Culture, the Center for Migration and Development, the Program in Latin American Studies, and also the Woodrow Wilson School and the James Madison Program. All of these were instrumental. I would like to thank the panelists because these people are really distinguished. And I asked them one time and they said yes. I did not have to beg to get 4 people. I was quite capable of doing that if I needed to. But they all said yes. And so Roger Hernandez, Doug Massey, and Doug is a contributor to my book. I had to beg to get Doug to contribute to my book, but I did. And he said yes. Bob Wuthnow now is someone that I have admired for a long time, and he made time for me. I called him in the morning on a busy day. He told me to stop by that afternoon, and he immediately agreed to talk about religion and one chapter in particular. And then Peter Schuck, We have corresponded for a long time, and I feel like I know him very well, and I'm just thrilled to have them here, and I'm thrilled to have you all here. Now that I've given this big thank you, let's give them a hand. Now, the book, Debating Immigration, came out of a conference that I held at Princeton in 2005 when I was on leave. I was a fellow in the James Madison program, and I was here for a year. At that time, immigration was not as hot as it is now, or as it became last year, but I had a feeling, based on research I had done earlier on white nationalism, that it was going to be an explosive issue. At the time, 2000, 2003, 2002, 2000, I was collecting data on white nationalists, and people repeatedly kept bringing up the issue of immigration. It was not being addressed by the politicians. If you go to the 2000, 2004 presidential debates, immigration was mentioned twice, once in connection with terrorism. But it was an issue that many Americans cared about, but the politicians avoided it as long as they could. And I believe what led them to finally take it on was the emergence of the Minutemen and women. And I know we'd all like to say that these are white extremists and they are KKK types, but it's not actually true. That some of these were ordinary men and women that lived in border states that got tired of their property being trampled, and they decided that if the U.S. government was not going to enforce immigration laws, that they were going to do it themselves. Obviously, it's very dangerous to have armed citizens. You know, maybe they were armed with a Coke or a lawn chair or umbrella, but some of them may have had weapons that were more serious, but we couldn't have a situation in the country where you have citizens patrolling the border. And I believe that that was a factor in politicians becoming involved in the issue. That was one factor. And then politicians began to see the public that there was some gain to be had there, and they jumped in. Many have changed their positions on the issue. My goal in bringing together the people that I brought together for the conference, there were activists, journalists, and scholars. I brought together people who have taken very diverse positions, including a person, Peter Brimelow, that some people would dismiss as a white nationalist. And I felt it was important to include his voice because whether we like it or not, you know, this is America. He represents a viewpoint, and he's very articulate. He's an immigrant himself, and I felt that he needed to be a part of the conversation. My goal was to bring together people who rarely converse, who you would not normally get in the same room. So I was able to get Peter Brimelow and Tamara Jacoby in the same room. And this was, everyone was civil. I believe we had a constructive debate. But after that ended, I felt that there was a need to go further than just a conference and to commission essays that went beyond what was covered at the conference. And so one of the topics I felt that was being neglected was religion and race. And you say, religion? How could religion be neglected? At the time, I felt that the viewpoint was pretty much dominated by a liberal Catholic view of open borders, and that a lot of Protestants at the time seemed to be silent on the issue, or they were seen as being racist, nativist, and I wanted to explore, you know, whether or not if you were immigration restrictionist, does that make you a racist? I didn't think it did, but at any rate, I felt that there may be a Protestant view that needed to be included. Protestants are divided on this issue, so there's not a one Protestant view on immigration, and there's not a one Catholic view on immigration, but there are leaders on both sides that tend to dominate the debate. And I also felt that African Americans were not getting the attention that they deserve, that they are the group that are being harmed, and much of the research will say that immigration only negatively impacts a small sector of the population, but what is not talked about often is the fact that these are low-wage, low-skill Americans of all races that are sort of being neglected. My goal in this, my goal in everything that I do, is to do no harm. Thank you.
Let me just start out by saying that when Dean McCarty introduced me as being to his far left, that was just a physical description of where I was sitting. Anyway, it feels great to be wanted at Princeton 35 years after I got rejected by Princeton, and ended up going to the other school up the road with the football team. I spoke and I write my syndicated column, so I spoke in a lot of places, and I speak in class at NJIT twice a week, and I teach at Rutgers too, a journalism course. So I'm used to being places to speak, but I have to say that I'm honored and really humbled to be speaking at this particular place. I think it says a lot for this country that a street kid from Union City can grow up to be a nationally syndicated columnist, and that the nationally syndicated columnist is essentially an ink-stained wretch, like all journalists, can come here and stand before one of the finest institutions of learning in the entire world and speak. That being said, it's also important to remember that there are some very serious problems insofar as people like myself, immigrants in this country. Let me read you a quote. It says, any man who says he is an American but something else also isn't an American at all. We have room but for one flag, the American flag. We have room but for one language here, and that is the English language. That was Teddy Roosevelt in 1919. That quote was emailed to me by a reader of my column. My columns about immigration gets so much more email than any other columns, which kind of is a gauge of what people are thinking out there. That quote, I think what he thought when he sent it was sort of like, touche. I sure shut out that hyphenated Hernandez guy. I look at it a different way, though. The way I look at it is that that quote, what it proves is that this myth of the great immigrant of yesteryear who got off the boat and learned English in 2 minutes, it's a myth. Back then, people were as worried about assimilation and about becoming American and about language as people are today. When it comes to language, there was a study by the Pew Foundation, which was conducted in 2004. What I found was, when it comes to Hispanics specifically, those who were second-generation American or higher, 78% were English dominant, 22% said they were bilingual, and none said they were Spanish dominant. So this myth about Spanish taking over the country, and I'm offended when push one for Espanol, it's just not something to worry about. But ideologues don't let facts get in the way of an argument, so the fear of an immigrant has once again raised its head. The loudest voices, of course, come from the right, and I think it comes in the shape of what a lot of times appears to be a legitimate debate about the serious problem of illegal immigration. Every country has a right to control its borders. I think that the United States ought to know who's here and who isn't, and has every right to limit who comes in and who doesn't come in. The problem comes when arguments about illegal immigration slowly slide into arguments about immigration in general that sound xenophobic. Let me give you an example. This is something that Tom Tancredo, who's running for president, he's a congressman from Colorado, he's running for president. He's basically a one-note Johnny. His platform amounts to stop immigration. On his website, what he did is he said he was thoroughly impressed by an essay that was sent to him by a college kid And he was so excited that he inserted it into the congressional record. You can look at it on his website. Now, let me read you just a couple of sentences from this. I want you to try to follow so you can see how what begins as an argument against illegal immigration, which is fine, all of a sudden turns into an argument against immigration in general and about Hispanics in particular. This little essay said, the economic, social, and political results of illegal immigration, fine, in particular, the unique issues and problems posed by contemporary Hispanic immigration are detrimental to the United States. So you read that and you go, let me read it to you again. The economic, social, and political results of illegal immigration, in particular the unique issues and problems posed by contemporary Hispanic immigration, are detrimental to the United States. So you have to ask, what is he saying is detrimental to the United States? Hispanic immigration or illegal immigration? I think he's saying both. And I think Tom Tancredo is agreeing with him. I get the same time all the time from reader mail. Here's something that wasn't actually an email. It was something that was posted on an online forum where they were attacking my column, and they were attacking me, and they were attacking my family. They told me to go back to Mexico. I'm not Mexican. Last time I was there was on my honeymoon. Said, going back to language, the favorite topic. Language is the most basic element that unifies the culture and nation. Fine. And we can't even demand that the new immigrants learn this. The immigrant of the past wanted to assimilate, may that be Irish, Italian, German, Russian, whoever. The immigrant of today wants to not assimilate into the host nation and culture, the host nation and culture, and even despises us. You hear something like that, you can only throw your hands up and give up. You can't reason with someone like that, which leaves kind of some of the progressive arguments against illegal immigration. I think a lot of times they have to do with the economy, and of course, these are arguments that are also made on the right. The arguments have to do with immigrants and low-paying jobs. I hear low-paying jobs, and believe it or not, the first thing I thought about was my column. I'm an immigrant. I write a newspaper column. So my thought was, did I take that job away from a real American that could have been writing that column? And then I thought about it and I said, nah. No, because my column deals most of the time with Hispanic issues or with immigration. Therefore, if there wasn't a lot of immigration, my column probably wouldn't exist. That's sort of in a broader sense, an argument that's made by some economists. You know, there's arguments as to whether immigrants create more jobs than they take. I'm not an economist. I couldn't even begin to say who's right. I really don't know. I do know that the argument goes back decades, a century. I was doing research for one of my books, and I came across a flyer from 1845. It said, repel the influx of foreign influence, in capital letters, by repelling the influx of foreign immigrants. Makes sense. And this was about jobs, and it was about signed by an original member of the Old American Guard of 1845. So they were concerned that the German and Irish immigrants were taking jobs away from the Americans of those years. Today is Hispanic and Asian immigrants who are said to be taking jobs. And it may be we're taking jobs. I don't know. I'm not an economist. But I can say this. We have to think about how much that matters. Okay? If we're going to base immigration policy based on jobs, let's accept for a minute the worst case scenario, that is that every job filled by an immigrant, writing my column, mowing the lawn, pulling your teeth, is one job that our Native American doesn't have. Okay? You create policy based on that, and what happens is that you get in a time machine, and you have to go back and stop every ship that came from Europe, bringing Germans, bringing Italians, bringing Jewish people, bringing the Poles and bringing the Irish. Because if you're going to say that immigration is harmful to the country because they take away the jobs of Americans, then you can never have immigration. And this country would be something else entirely and not what it is. So we're here, and the question is, how are we going to fare? By the way, I skipped a part here. An interesting statistic is the latest estimate in 2006 is the foreign-born population of the United States, by the Census Bureau, is 12%. In 1910, after a decade after more than 9 million immigrants arrived, it was 14%. So actually, proportionally speaking, there were more foreign-born people, more immigrants back then in 1910 than there are now. So here we are, we're all these immigrants. Maybe they're taking jobs, maybe they're not. What are we going to do? What are immigrants going to do? What are other Americans going to do? I think we can begin by asking the rest of the country to have a better understanding of who Hispanics are. I think it begins with understanding that we're not a race. It's not white, black, and Hispanic. It's more complicated than that because Hispanic people can be of any race. The former president of Peru, who's on big legal trouble, was a guy named Alberto Fujimori, who was of Japanese ancestry. The liberator of Chile was a guy named, the George Washington of Chile was a guy named Bernardo O'Higgins, who was of Irish ancestry. Antonio Maceo was one of the greatest generals of the Cuban War of Independence. He was of black ancestry. You look at Hispanic Americans. Just to take Cubans, for example, you have Andy Garcia, the actor, the white guy, and you have El Duque, Orlando Hernandez, the Mets pitcher. I was going to say Yankee pitcher. I'm a Yankees fan. I always forget he's in the Mets. He's a black guy. So, Hispanic is not our race. We Hispanics are people who can be of any race or any combination of races. But we are an ethnic group, a cultural group, and I think that gives rise to prejudice and to xenophobia. I tend to agree with Amitai Etzioni when he speaks of integration as opposed to assimilation. He wrote, I join with those who see there are no compelling reasons to assimilate immigrants into one indistinguishable American blend. And he added that immigrants ought to become incorporated into American society, but simultaneously maintain some differences that may benefit immigrants and society as a whole. I think that's pretty much what's happening. Immigration is not a trouble-free process. How can it when it involves people who uproot themselves, like my parents did, or are uprooted from their homelands and then try to make a home in a new country where things look, taste, and sound different? When I was 12 years old, lived in Union City with my family, my dad and mom one day decided to make a day trip to visit some friends who had just come from Cuba a few months earlier and had settled in Philadelphia. We were not too far from Cuba ourselves. We had been there maybe a year and a half. I still have fresh in my mind memories of soldiers with machine guns. We used to call them checkas. They were checkmate submachine guns who had come to our house after my parents told the Castro government they wanted to leave the country. The soldiers came to pay a visit because they had to make sure everything we owned stayed behind after we left. So they took an inventory of everything we owned. And then the day we left, they came back with a list, and they had to go through it, and they had to make sure that everything was there. And if stuff was missing, you had to either account for it or you were in trouble. So they walked around the house, carrying their machine guns, making a list of every item they found. They listed everything from furniture to eating utensils. There's an image engraved in my mind still of a soldier in green fatigues with his machine gun slung on his shoulder, standing in our kitchen, pulling out forks, knives, and spoons, and counting them out. Imagine a child who has seen these soldiers come to his house for a simple reason that his family wanted to leave the country. Now put this little kid in Philadelphia, the Liberty Bell, and the Constitution Hall, artifact to symbolize the good side of American history. I think it's the very vitality of American communities that show America at its best, as a country of political freedom and economic opportunity. So I try to keep the perspective of that little Cuban kid who was in awe of American democracy. And I see that Hispanic and other immigrants are looking for ways to keep hold of what is valuable about our ancestral cultures, and at the same time embrace what is good about life in the United States. But even if we do that, I think it's wise, and ironically, it's the Americanized part of me speaking, it's the Americanized part of me that has made me more aware about the ugly side of American life. And that, too, is part of being an American. Thank you.
I want to thank Carol for organizing this fine conference and for putting together the book, because I do think that immigration is one of the most misunderstood issues of our day. In the late 1990s, the United States found itself at the center of an emerging global economy characterized by rapid movement across borders of goods, of capital, of information, of services, and many kinds of people. In a global economy where all the factors of production are in motion, we observe immigration as a movement of two kinds of people: people bearing human capital, skills and abilities, education, who are generally in short supply and are generally sought to be recruited by different countries around the world. At the same time, we observe movement of labor. And this is what most people think of when they think about immigrants, the trans-border movement of labor. Somehow, most industrial countries today want to achieve what I think is the impossible. They want to create and be part of an integrated global economy characterized by the free movement of all factors of production except one. They want to reap the benefits of a global trading regime, reap the benefits of economic growth achieved through globalization, but somehow not have any movement of labor within this system. Some would go so far as to say no movement of even the skilled workers that come in from abroad. This, I think, is logically contradictory and practically impossible. Nonetheless, the United States has attempted to do precisely this. And this is nowhere more apparent than in our treatment of Mexico. Beginning in 1986, under U.S. guidance, Mexico moved closer to economic integration with the rest of the world and with North America. In 1986, under heavy pressure from the U.S. government, Mexico joined the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. In 1988, President Carlos Salinas approached the United States and asked to join the North American Free Trade Agreement. This overture was received with welcome ears by the then Bush I administration, and trade negotiations began and were finalized in 1993. And in 1994, under President Clinton, Mexico entered the North American Free Trade Agreement. From that day forward, from January 1st, 1994 forward to the present day, we have been committed by treaty, by mutual consent, by design, to creating an integrated North American economy, characterized by the relatively free movement of goods across the Mexico, U.S., and Canadian border, the flow of capital across these borders, the flow of raw materials and resources across these borders, the flow of agricultural products across these borders, the flow of services across these borders, the flow of certain categories of people across these borders: tourists, skilled workers, business executives, investors. But magically, within this integrated economy that we've created, we want to prevent the movement of labor. And to maintain and to finesse this ultimate contradiction, since 1986, as we've opened up our economy to Mexico and integrated within North America, we've simultaneously sought to militarize the border. We've militarized the border with a country that is, in fact, one of our largest trading partners, a peaceful nation with a standing army that poses no conceivable threat to the United States, is home to no known Islamic terrorist cells, and, in fact, remains one of our largest and most important allies in the world. Nonetheless, from 1986 to the present, as trade between Mexico and the United States and the volume of people crossing the border for legitimate purposes has increased by factors of 8 to 10, we have dramatically increased the size and firepower of the Border Patrol. The Border Patrol has gone from a small agency of under 2,000 officers to presently more than 12,000. When the Border Patrol went from Department of Justice to Homeland Security, suddenly they became very secretive about the numbers of Border Patrol officers, so I'm not quite sure about the exact number now. But it's something in excess of 12,000, and the budget is currently more than 1.4 billion. The Border Patrol is the largest arms-bearing branch of the federal government, with the exception of the military itself. This armed force is deployed along the border in an effort to stop illegal migrants. Even as the border becomes more porous with respect to the movement of goods and transportation and services and all kinds of things. Now, the sad part about all this is that we're spending billions of dollars on border enforcement, which is worse than useless. It's counterproductive, because our effort to have our cake and eat it too, to create an integrated economy where everything moves except one thing, has backfired, and backfired in every respect. First of all, it has not stopped the inflow of migrants. The inflow of migrants has continued, with minor fluctuations owing to differences in the economy on both sides of the border. If you look at the long-term trends from 1980 to the present, the rate of illegal migration from Mexico to the United States has not changed, up or down. It has simply fluctuated and gone on. What has changed dramatically in the ensuing years has been the rate of out-migration. Before we began to militarize the border, the flow of Mexican workers into the country was offset by a substantial return flow. When you increase the costs and risks of border crossing, immigrants, being rational creatures, behave rationally, and they minimize border crossing. And they do this not by deciding to stay put in Mexico, but by hunkering down to stay once they've run the gauntlet at the border, and they stay here. So in the course of the past 15 years, our attempt to have our cake and eat it too, to militarize the border with our largest trading partner, has backfired. It hasn't affected the rate of in-migration, but it has dramatically reduced the rate of out-migration, cutting it by half. Now, you don't need a Ph.D. in demography to figure out that if you have a rate of inflow that's constant and a rate of outflow that's falling, net migration is going to increase. And in fact, we have seen an explosion in undocumented population growth in the United States, not because of a change in the inflow, but because of a change in the outflow that is entirely an artifact of our own border policy. Second thing that's happened is that the border, the concentration of enforcement resources at the border was highly localized. Before 1994, before the 1990s, 85% of all border crossings occurred in two sectors, San Diego and El Paso. That's where we put up the wall of enforcement resources. That's where we put all the materiel. That's where we put all the personnel and the equipment. The net effect is, of course, that we deterred people from crossing in those sectors. But what happened was they simply went around. And so if you're in Arizona, you believe the world is turned upside down. You believe, your eyes tell you every day, that suddenly we're being invaded by thousands of migrants, when in point of fact, nothing has really changed except the locus of border crossing. You have shifted a flow of, say, 10,000 people a week who went from a population of 1 million in Tijuana to a population of 2.5 million in San Diego, 40% of which is Mexican. That flow didn't attract a lot of attention. And now those 10,000 people per week are crossing over empty desert into empty ranch land, crossing places that had been quiet before. And if you live in Arizona, the world is turned upside down, and you believe there's been this massive transformation. But the only thing that's changed is that the flows have been shifted away from urbanized, built-up areas into remote country. And after the flows were diverted away from traditional receiving areas, evidence suggests they kept on going. California, before 1990, received 2/3 of all Mexican immigrants to the United States. According to census data and CPS data from the year after the year 2000, California now receives 1/3 of Mexican immigrants to the United States. Where did all those other migrants that used to go to California, where did they go? The answer is everywhere. Before 1990, Mexican immigration was a phenomenon that affected 3 states, California, Texas, and Illinois. Chicago is one of the largest Mexican settlements in the United States. After 1990, it is a phenomenon affecting 50 states. The largest growing and most rapidly growing Mexican populations in the United States are not in California, not in Texas, not in Illinois. They are in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Nebraska, Iowa, places like that not only have not had Mexican immigrants before, they haven't had any immigrants for contemporary memory. So, in essence, our attempt to somehow finesse this contradiction, to militarize the border with one of our largest trading partners, with whom we're otherwise linked in a trade regime by mutual consent that almost guarantees cross-border movement of people, has backfired. We've transformed what had been a circular flow of male workers going to 3 states into a national population of settled families living in 50 states, driving up the rate of the costs to American taxpayers and exacerbating whatever economic problems that immigrants bring with them. So what I've been endeavoring to argue, not only to my fellow citizens here in the United States, but to residents of other developed societies around the world, lectures I've given in Japan, and China and Taiwan rather, and in Western Europe, most recently in Spain, is that rather than viewing immigration as some pathological condition that needs to be stamped out through repressive action, the way to view immigration is a natural consequence of broader changes in our own society and in the global economy. And that rather than adopting a stance of trying to stop the flows, one should endeavor to manage them, from immigration repression to immigration management. Attempt to regularize the flows and manage them in ways that benefit the sending countries, the receiving countries, the migrants themselves, and protect the workers in the host societies. I believe that if we adopted more sensible immigration reform, we would all be better off. And the model that I use here is what happened in the European Union. When the European Union brought Spain and Portugal in the 1980s. Spain and Portugal had come off of 60 years of dictatorship, protected economies, antiquated productive system. For centuries, they had been sending out migrants not only to Latin America, but in the post-war period, northward into Europe. And, of course, when Spain and Portugal knocked on the door of the European Union, people in Northern Europe were a little worried. Oh, we're going to be swamped by Spanish immigrants. If we really open the door, all this immigration we've observed in the past will just get worse, and we're not sure we want this. But the European Union was as much a political project as an economic project. And the Europeans, in the end, decided to bite the bullet and allow free labor mobility and free and common political membership in this broader union. The result was that when Spain finally joined the European Union, not only did migration not ensue, but it reversed itself. Spain experienced a massive return migration back to Spain, as integration within the European Union solved many of the market problems, solved many of the market failures, ensured a minimal level of social insurance coverage. If we had treated Mexico in 1994, when it was brought into NAFTA, in the same way that the European Union had treated Spain and Portugal, is my firm belief that we would not be facing this immigration crisis today. We would have a much smaller population of immigrants in the United States. We would have a fraction of the undocumented population we have in this country. Mexico would be more developed. Wages would be higher in the United States. Income inequality would be less, and everyone would be better off. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I too want to thank Carol for creating the book and recruiting us to contribute to it and convening this conference. Carol's persuasive powers, by my experience, are legendary and vast. When I was first invited to the initial conference, I could not attend for one reason or another, and she said, well, why don't you send me a couple of paragraphs what you would have said. So I sent her that, the next thing I know, she has inveigled me into writing a chapter and in recruiting Nathan Glazer to write the summary. So I'm very glad that she possesses these powers of persuasion, and I think the quality of the book testifies to her good judgment, present company excluded. Now I'm going to do something very unusual, evidently. Carol told me what she wanted me to do, and I'm going to do it. She asked me to review 3 of the chapters from the book, those concerned with law and policy, to summarize those chapters, and then to perhaps comment on where I think those chapters fall short. So much as I would like to pontificate about immigration generally, and perhaps in the Q&A I will, for now I'm going to do what I'm told. So the first chapter is by the first chapter I'm reviewing is by Linda Bosniak, who's a professor down the road at Rutgers, law professor. She wrote a chapter on the undocumented, and she makes a couple of important distinctions which frame the analysis in her chapter. The first is a distinction that is very familiar to those who study immigration law, and that's the distinction between immigration policy on the one hand and immigrant policy on the other. The distinction being, with respect to immigration policy, the focus on the regulation of immigration through the government agencies, decisions having to do with the number and terms of admission, the grounds for deportation, the existence of certain remedies to prevent deportation, detention policies, and so forth. Of course, government enforcement policies. Immigrant policy, by contrast, is concerned with the treatment of immigrants, both legal and undocumented, once they're here. And their relation, it is a distinction also that speaks to the locus of government that is concerned with these 2 types of policies. Immigration policy, the one I mentioned first, is entirely the province of the federal government. Under the plenary power doctrine, as the Supreme Court has dubbed it, the states and localities have no role whatsoever in determining the conditions of admission, deportation, detention, enforcement, adjustment of status, and the like. With respect to immigrant policy, that is the treatment of immigrants with respect to the rights that they can claim against private or public limitation, that is primarily, not exclusively, primarily the province of states and localities, and that's particularly true in recent years when, as you probably have read in the newspapers, a number of localities, hundreds of localities in fact, have enacted ordinances that are designed to punish or discriminate or against or discourage immigrants from coming to or remaining in their communities. The immigrant policy, that is again the regulation of the rights of immigrants against the state, is based upon the notion of personhood, which is to say it's based upon the idea that individuals who are within our jurisdiction are entitled to certain basic entitlements, rights, which are to be enforceable by the courts and by other agencies of government, merely by virtue of the fact that they are persons and not by virtue of their particular legal status. So she develops that distinction, and it's an exceedingly important one. As I've suggested, from a structural point of view, you have different levels of government dealing with the 2 types of policies, and you have different notions of the source of regulatory power, one vested in the government through its plenary power, and the other rooted in the personhood of individual immigrants. The second important framing idea in her chapter is the nature of the border, the scope of the border, and the extent to which different participants in the immigration debate have varying views of where the border begins and where it ends. So restrictionists tend to have a very formalistic geographical conception of the border. The border is at the Rio Grande River, for example, in connection with Mexico, or the Arizona border further west. Whereas those who are more receptive to immigration think of the border as internal and not simply geographic. That is to say, we have to adjudicate the rights of immigrants according to the particular interests that are at stake, regardless of where they happen to be physically. And I think that's a very useful distinction. She mentions a number of developments which I think illuminate this distinction between the way in which restrictionists and immigration supporters view the border. And I'll just mention a couple of them because I'm supposed to spend 5 minutes on each of these chapters. One is the 9/11 Victims' Compensation Fund, which in one of its most important policy decisions determined that immigrants would be entitled to claim against the fund regardless of their legal status. And efforts were made to protect them against detection if they were in illegal status, much less reporting to the government. A second kind of a policy that varies depending upon one's view of where the border is and what constitutes it is the adoption of various verification and reporting requirements, under which communities and institutions are required, if the law is drafted this way, to determine the legal status of immigrants and report that status to the authorities, the enforcement authorities. And here the most extreme examples of reporting and verification and reporting are Proposition 187 in California, which was enacted during the early 1990s, subsequently stayed by the courts, but had a major impact on the elections in California and is generally viewed as having been a very extreme and harsh series of enforcement initiatives against the undocumented. And then Proposition 200 in Arizona only a few years ago, which basically adopts the same approach. In commenting on her fine chapter, I want to call into question a couple of her assumptions. One is very widespread among supporters of immigration, of whom I count myself as an enthusiastic member, is that state and local government involvement in immigration enforcement amounts to less protection for immigrants. There's an assumption that Congress will treat, and the administrative agency, federal administrative agency will treat, have greater affection for, sympathy for, and inclined to be protective of immigrants than state and local governments. I think that's true in some cases, but there are many, many exceptions, and I think there are lots of reasons why states and localities, although they may certainly play to the political concerns of their constituents, are actually considerably more pro-immigration than Congress is. And the reasons are not difficult to imagine. It has a lot to do with the local economy and the extent to which immigrants are vital in the growth of that economy. And we see, for example, the New York Times just a couple of days ago had an article in which it highlighted a particular community that had adopted restrictive anti-immigrant ordinances that is now abolishing or repealing those restrictions because it has laid the local economy to waste. So that's an important assumption that I think seriously needs to be questioned. I've recently written something that takes that criticism a bit farther. A second assumption is that public attitudes towards immigration are fixed and static. And I think that's wrong, although it is the case, it is certainly true, as my chapter points out, that public attitudes viewed statistically have not varied all that much over time. There is a majority, depending upon how the question is phrased, a majority of people, when asked about immigration, prefer that there be fewer immigrants than there are. And that has been the case for as long as public opinion polling on this issue has been conducted. Still, the circumstances in which a debate is conducted and the measures that are taken with respect to the control of immigration can have a lot to do with political attitudes and public support or antipathy to immigration. For example, if the public believes that the border is out of control, something to which Professor Massey referred to a moment ago and suggested, among other things, that in that sense the border has always been out of control. There's always been massive migration across it, and that this has, in many respects, been a good thing. But to the extent that the public believes that the border is out of control, they're going to hunker down. They're going to feel much more protective of their interests, think about their interests in different ways, and evince a greater hostility to immigrants. So it's very important, I think, for politicians and supporters of immigration, as all of us are, to be attentive to that and to try to adopt measures that will reassure the public that its judgments about the appropriate level of immigration are at least being heeded. And if they think that they're not being heeded, then there will be a backlash, as has occurred on a number of occasions. The last point I want to make about the chapter by Linda Bosniak is that there's an assumption, and I think it's an assumption that may be shared by many members of the audience and perhaps some of the panelists as well, that the immigration debate is really unique in its capacity to arouse strong emotions and perhaps even irrational responses. And I think that's not the case. Of course, every public policy domain is unique. It has its own politics, its own ideology, its own slogans, its own political dynamics. But if you think of any of the issues that are roiling the national scene today, be it Social Security or health care or abortion or globalization, they are all some complex amalgam of facts, values, myths, misrepresentations, and distortions. And I don't think immigration is at all unique in this sense. Well, the second chapter in the section on law and policy is a wonderful chapter by Noah Pickus and Peter Skerry, two prominent immigration scholars, and they entitled their chapter "Good Neighbors and Good Citizens." And the first thing they want to do is to ambiguate or muddy the distinction that dominates the debate between legal immigration and illegal immigration, and also the distinction between U.S. citizens and non-citizens. And in doing so, they distinguish between the vertical relationships between individual immigrants and the government, which is primarily concerned with legal status, illegality, or versus legality, or citizenship versus non-citizenship. And they want to emphasize instead the horizontal relationships between immigrants and others in the community. And their tagline is that we should be concerned, that most Americans are concerned less with whether immigrants will make good citizens than whether they will make good neighbors. And here's what they mean by good neighbors. They say, where is it? Most Americans are less worried about immigrants having proper documents or being able to answer questions about American history and politics than they're behaving like responsible members of the community. Are immigrants making too much noise? Are they attempting to communicate in English? Are they parking their cars where there's supposed to be grass? Are they crowding too many people into their living quarters? Are they cluttering the neighborhood with abandoned shopping carts or cars? And it goes on and on. And I think there's a lot. To that. Of course, they are also concerned about the political virtues that they hope immigrants will exemplify: to naturalizing, voting, paying attention to public issues, participating in public processes. But that's a very fundamental distinction that they develop very nicely. A second theme is, I think, quite consistent with what Doug Massey said a moment ago, or implied a moment ago, which is that